So should we get started? Yeah. Greetings, everybody. Our third member of our panel, David Herszenhorn, is on his way, but not quite here yet. But we decided we wouldn't keep you waiting much longer. Hopefully David will be with us in a few minutes. So I'm Thomas de Waal from Carnegie Europe.
I'm Alissa de Carbonnel from the International Crisis Group.
So we don't have a moderator, so we have to introduce ourselves, as it were. But David will be with us. It's great to have you all here, and thanks for making it out in the rain. I think there are many more people watching online, so kudos for those of you who battled through the lovely Brussels weather to be with us today. So we're going to be talking about what is a kind of the neighborhood of both Russia and other powers, whether that be the EU, obviously, but also China, Turkey, other powers, the kind of, and how these other powers have navigated the difficult times, not just in the last 2 years, but generally. And I've written, I hope you've seen a report called "The End of the Near Abroad." It's about the kind of failure of Russia's attempt to have a kind of sphere of influence policy, and that I think the war in Ukraine is obviously the biggest symptom of that, but it's also a longer term process. Alissa will and I will have a conversation, but why don't I just open with a few general remarks. So I'm speaking as someone who worked in Russia in the 1990s, but then in the last 20 years worked much more in other parts of the former Soviet Union, particularly South Caucasus. So this paper comes out of having that kind of dual perspective, both on Russia looking out and the other post-Soviet republics looking in. And obviously, what we've seen in the last 2 years is a complete change in that relationship. You know, one can describe it as Russia going rogue with the war in Ukraine. Russia's pretensions to be a security patron, to be a security umbrella, I think completely blown away by the war in Ukraine. But it was not always like this. Russia in the 1990s, there were definitely competing visions of how Russians were going to build their relationships with their neighbors. There was, I think, a strong constituency to say we're starting again as a post-imperial nation state. To some extent, I think that narrative was continued by Alexei Navalny. What we often heard in Russia in those years was a lot of people saying we want Russia to be a quote-unquote normal country without any imperial pretensions, without any big foreign military adventures. And if you listen to Navalny talking about Russian foreign policy, you often use that phrase as well, a normal country. But obviously, Putin took Russia in a different direction, and we can discuss why and how that happened. But clearly, there's always been this imperialist strain as well within the Russian elite thinking, which I think it's fair to say when one reads and hears what he says that Putin for sure believes in, but is also, I would argue, a kind of legitimizing strategy for perpetuating his own rule. That if you want to be an emperor, it suits you to have imperialism as your ideology. But I argue in the paper that I think we have to break down this idea of Russian imperialism. It's multi-layered. There's always been differentiation in the Russian capital, whether imperial or Soviet or post-Soviet, about how you look at the neighbors, differentiation between different regions. There's regions of core interest, Ukraine being absolutely a region of core interest. But there's also Central Asia and South Caucasus, I think, are more instrumental. I think they were never colonized. They were never fully integrated culturally identity-wise into either the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. So decolonization, I think, was easier there on both sides. And I think the war in Ukraine has accelerated that process of decolonization on a societal level. But I would argue that for elites, it's much more transactional in those countries, particularly in Central Asia and Azerbaijan, which are one-party states. They're still doing a lot of business with Russia, both political and especially economic. And I think one of the paradoxes of the post-Ukraine invasion situation is that because of Western sanctions, suddenly these countries, their economic relationship with Russia has actually increased since the war rather than decreased. And on a more equal level, they are more economic partners with Russia than they were before. In a bizarre way, I would argue that the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, has broken down, but the Eurasian Economic Union, in a strange way, actually works in a way that it never did before, because countries like Kazakhstan, even Armenia, are suddenly doing a lot more trade with Russia. Russia needs them, basically. Russia's, in order to fight its war in Ukraine, Russia needs to survive economically, and so the neighbors to the south and the east, which are not part of the sanctions regime, are important. And you can see multiple figures of GDP going up, trade being increased. So there's that insecurity about this Russia going rogue, at the same time combined with an economic partnership. And let's not forget that these are elites which are still very Soviet in their background, in their mentality. They all speak Russian. They understand one another. They speak the same language. They know where each other's red lines are. And as I point out in the paper, when I say that the CSTO, the security organization, is no longer fit for purpose, it didn't intervene in the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. It didn't intervene between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. It did intervene once, which was just before Ukraine invasion in January 2022. It intervened to support a fellow regime in trouble in Kazakhstan. So conflict prevention was less important than propping up a friendly regime in a neighboring state. But regime type matters, as a political scientist might say. For two democracies in particular, the relationship with Russia is breaking down. Those are Moldova, which obviously has many options now that it didn't have before. Alissa's, I know, working on Moldova. We can talk about that. Moldova's path towards the European Union has been massively accelerated by the war in Ukraine. Its energy dependence on Russia has basically gone. But I think the important thing here is, as a democracy, there isn't a basis for deal-making between Moldova and Moscow, and I would argue Armenia as well in a different way. You can't do a deal over the head of your society. You derive your democracy, you derive your legitimacy from democracy, so you just can't have the same sort of conversations, the same kind of deal-making if you're sitting in Yerevan or Chisinau that you have with Moscow. And then which I think finally brings us to Georgia, which I'm sure is on everyone's mind. I've also just published something on Georgia just today. I think Georgia is very much a hybrid case. I think society and many of the institutions are extremely pro-Western. They also, for obvious reasons, want nothing to do with Russia. But there's an elite which now has decided it does want to do business with Russia. I don't believe Georgian Dream wants political alignment with Russia, but it very much wants to do business. It very much wants business deals, economic partnership with Russia, and alignment also on cultural conservative issues as well. So Georgia is a strange hybrid case. And in all these hedging countries, I think obviously the important thing to say to kind of end where we began is that the war in Ukraine is absolutely pivotal. They're all watching Ukraine. I don't think Mr. Ivanishvili and Georgian Dream would be making the same decisions as he is now if Ukraine was doing better in the war. Clearly, the hedging is tilting towards Russia because they see a more powerful Russia, unfortunately, in 2024, looking towards, a summer offensive in Ukraine. Likewise, I think the Armenian government, I was told this in Yerevan, started making statements, choices about its pro-Western orientation last summer, and everyone says that they had been persuaded that Ukraine was winning the war, Ukraine was about to retake territory, and that therefore it was time to make a decisive move to unhitch yourself from the Russian wagon and re-hitch yourself to the West. As we know, Armenia making this difficult pivot away from Russia to the West, a pivot which is quite rash given Armenia's huge institutional and economic dependence on Russia, but one they basically decided to make, but I think one that they might have done more cautiously if it weren't for what was the situation in Ukraine last year. So we're still waiting for David, but let's plow ahead. Moldova, you've been working on Moldova, Alissa. How would you say that Moldova fits into this general picture of everyone watching Ukraine, calibrating their actions?
Yeah, well, I think that you laid out the categories of government quite well to kind of divide up in certain ways, but definitely the hedging and the watching of Ukraine, if you travel to these countries and speak to people, is incredibly true. It's true in several ways. I think there is definitely also watching not just how Russia is faring, but obviously how Western support for Ukraine, how strong that has been, how that has waxed and waned. And certainly when you are Armenia, Moldova has had much more investment, recently a security deal, its ties with Europe, as you point out in your paper, are much stronger in part because of its geography. But certainly for Armenia, there is a question mark of this pivot to the West. What is the real reality of what the West can offer? So, a question I get frequently from interlocutors and journalists is, what kind of security guarantees can the West offer Armenia? And I think the real answer is that, Western diplomats were also cautioning Armenia not to leave the CSTO, because the reality is there's only so far they can really balance against Russia's influence there. There are economic realities, as you point out, this sort of paradox that even as there's a turn towards the West on the part of the leadership, the economic ties are growing stronger and trade is growing stronger with Russia. So in Moldova, that's not the case, right? Moldova has really made an effort to diversify, with a lot of Western support, to really stop buying Russian gas, to start building the infrastructure that it needs in order to have electricity from elsewhere, from then the Russian gas-fired, partially Russian-owned plant in Transnistria, its breakaway region, from which it buys most of its electricity. And that is the remaining most difficult sort of lever, I think, that Russia has. So there is a real reality. But, I mean, one of the things that I think in the context of the Georgia protest is really interesting to bring up is, so you have an increasing EU and Western presence, but you have to fill this sort of gap of Russian influence, things that we could never imagine before, EU facilitating for a while Armenia, Azerbaijan peace talks, right, the enlargement, momentum that we've seen, the EU mission to the Armenian border, any number of things that would have been unthinkable in a world prior to the war. But you also have sort of, I'm not going to call them the death throes because they're quite successful, of Russia trying to redouble its influence in different countries. And, in Moldova we see, in Georgia we see, that really does take the form of disinformation, very low-cost kind of influence. Where there are hard economic levers, those are still things that the leadership considers. And where those are less real, like somewhere in Moldova, there is still a population that is quite divided. And if some things like in Georgia, the foreign agent law, right, there's an 80%, or the polling is overwhelmingly pro-European. David has just joined us. So I will finish my thought and then we can do proper introduction. Just there's another trend, which is also the foreign agent law basically was conceived of in Russia when both David and I were based there as journalists over a decade ago. But there were also measures, more conservative measures against LGBTQ activists, this kind of turn towards the traditional church kind of efforts on anti-abortion in a country at the time, Russia, where abortion was run-of-the-mill because of the Soviet history and the lack of care there. So that is successful. That is still something, that has traction in a lot of countries in the region, and it is positioned as a kind of anti-Western, anti-EU values that where Russian, propaganda and disinformation has still influence. So I guess I'm saying it's a very nuanced story. And on that note, I'll introduce David.
David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, and apologies to everyone for being late. The news business remains unpredictable, as Alissa remembers. I'm David Herszenhorn. I'm the Russia-Ukraine East Europe editor at the Washington Post, former Moscow correspondent for the New York Times. In between, I worked just down the way at Political Europe, covering Brussels and the EU and NATO. I think that about sums it up.
And he's just written a book on Navalny, so.
Right. I just mentioned Navalny actually earlier in some of my opening remarks, David. I was saying about paths not taken for Russia, that there was competing vision. When I was in Russia in the 90s, there were competing visions about the new post-Soviet Russia. Obviously Navalny's views evolved, but I think I would describe him as an anti-imperialist nationalist. I don't know if that would be a...
That's close, yeah.
Someone who wanted a Russian nation state. He had some fairly xenophobic views at various points, but didn't want to drag Russia into big foreign adventures, wanted to, talked about shedding the North Caucasus very much. So he had a certain post-imperial vision, which I think a lot of Russians,
or a neo-democratic vision.
Yeah.
I think you've been talking about this, right? There was an opportunity after the Soviet collapse, even maybe still after Yeltsin was finished, for Russia to become the rival on the world stage to the US that Putin hopes it to be. But it would have had to take a different path, right, to a country that was a place of rule of law and free speech and openness. And then there might have been some competition that a lot of us would have been happy to see. And in fact, it went completely the other way. I mean, Navalny, his national streak came largely from an effort to find a coalition, any coalition that would challenge the monolith that was Putin and United Russia, right? So it is still the same tension that you're describing. And picking up on Alyssa's point, because I'm super interested and was just reading and editing about the role of women in Russia and how that's changing now in a dramatic way. That social argument that Putin is making now has a lot of currency. This idea of Russia as the defender of traditional values, it's a clear pitch to the global south, this anti-gay, anti-trans, sort of fear-mongering. And we saw it in 2014 in East Ukraine, in Donbass, right? I mean, when it was really, now with the war, folks forget how much of this was a fight between Russia and the EU and the effort to stop Yanukovych from signing the association agreement, the political association agreement, the deep and free comprehensive trade agreement. And Viktor Medvedchuk, Putin's best pal in Ukraine, was running this NGO that had billboards up that were warning of Euro-Sodom, Yever-Sodomea, and showing stick figures of two dads and kids. And
people on the front, right, that we met in East Ukraine would say, like, miners who had taken up arms were fighting against gay marriage. Okay, I mean, look, it's not everybody, but that was.
No, but it has currency, and he realized that.
I mean, I would actually say that it's bigger than Russia. Russia's key. I've just, in the piece I've written on Georgia, I just said that Georgian Dream wants to join, I think I described it as the European chapter of Illiberalism International. Illiberalism International being a club of nations who, talk this language of anti-globalism, that we defend our sovereignty against the globalist forces of EU and US. Of course, they like the global international system, but financial system, but that's another story. And very much this language of gay marriage, of sex and gender issues, and I would say that club comprises Orban, Erdogan, Aliyev, possibly even stretching out to Modi with Trump there in the background as well, and it's quite attractive business model in the sense that you're non-aligned, but you can do deals with Russia, who so as not to touch you. You can even stay part of Western institutions if you're Hungary, and you capture the state domestically, and therefore you have a domestic business model as well, which is quite corrupt.
But Orban is the perfect example, right? Of no enemy of EU money when it flows into his budget, but proclaiming himself a champion of illiberal democracy, right? Of a Christian illiberal democracy, these religious overtones, which certainly Putin has adopted, and yeah, it does stretch across the whole neighborhood.
And just to finish that point, a very close relationship between Orban and Georgian Dream, the governing party of Georgia. Last year, they were formerly part of the centre-left coalition in the European Parliament. They suddenly made this sharp transition to the far right. The two successive Georgian prime ministers have turned up at the CPAC, the far right summit hosted in Budapest, talking on this illiberal language. Orban has visited Georgia, and I think it's Balázs Orban, who is a close ally of Viktor, was tweeting earlier this week, not only is this foreign agents law not bad, but the whole of the EU should be adopting it, he said.
You're reminding me of one of the most striking moments that I remember covering the EU. It was an EU-Arab League summit in Egypt, and Leo Varadkar and Javi Patel, prime ministers of Ireland and Luxembourg, stood up and spoke out in favor of marriage equality. Not exactly a friendly audience for that. And Sisi gets up and talks about the importance of the death penalty, and don't lecture to us about the death penalty. Sometimes our people demand vengeance, and it's our job as politicians to deliver vengeance. And striking to see where Russia is looking for friends now, including in the Middle East, and talk in Russia of bringing back the death penalty, something that Putin used to chide the US about all the time, that the US is still executing people and how barbaric and uncivilized. But in fact, that pendulum is swinging in those directions. That's alarming in many ways.
I'll just pick up on that. I mean, I do think that's also a reflection of how much Russian society has changed, how violence is becoming normalized because of the war. We saw the reaction, very violent reaction to the terrorist attacks. There were plenty of terrorist attacks when we were there, but certainly not people obviously tortured, dragged into courtrooms. There was probably more effort to hide it. But I like that you guys made the point that that it's a kind of a tool that authoritarian or more less democratic governments are trying to use to bolster their image and to strengthen it. So it has some traction. It's not Russia that's dictating any of these things, but the tools are it's kind of a toolbox that is now being adopted in other places. And one of the things that, just bring it back to the EU and the contested, one of the things that I worry about and that I think is kind of interesting is, you know, you have this great momentum for EU enlargement, and you have the protests that echo what happened in Ukraine, right, during Maidan, and now you're going to have an EU referendum in Moldova at the same time as the presidential elections in October. You know, there's a large amount of support for the EU. Less clear how the presidential election itself will go, but then the process is quite long, and it's technical, and it drags on, and we're not there tomorrow. And what happens in those intervening years, and whether there's a change in government in Georgia or not, whether there's a change in government in Moldova or not, because that's a possibility. There's parliamentary elections after presidential elections in Moldova. I mean, these things are still very much contested, and one of the things that you brought up in your paper, which I thought was really interesting, was we shouldn't always assume that change in the neighborhood brings a more democratic, Western-leaning government. I mean, we've seen you know, alongside what's happening in Georgia, we've seen the protest, and I'm sure you can speak a bit about this in not the protest, but the adoption of the foreign agent law in Kyrgyzstan, which used to be a darling of the West to a certain extent, of donor support, of donor engagement, the sort of more democratic of the Central Asian countries, and that's certainly been a change in a different direction now.
So at some point we need to open up to questions, and there are also, I think, some coming in online which will be passed to us, but
Well, maybe give me 1 second.
Yeah.
One question
Sure.
for Tom that I was waiting for this event to ask you about, and that is the areas in the neighborhood where things aren't going so well for Russia. And while this sort of social engineering has currency in some places, Armenia, Azerbaijan is an area where we see the Russian peacekeepers may have done many things, but one thing they did not do was keep any peace. Mm-hmm. And there is that presence there and a risk of meddling, but we've seen the relationship with Armenia change completely. The relationship with Azerbaijan hasn't changed as much, but Azerbaijan very much now owing its triumph in Nagorno-Karabakh to Erdogan in Turkey. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the...
I see it a little differently. I see Russia as, well, I mean, I think just before you came, David, I was making the argument that Russia is so focused on Ukraine, on a military victory in Ukraine, that it's now treating Central Asia and the Caucasus in a more equitable way as partners, particularly as economic partners, that it needs economic survival is the absolute priority, and therefore suddenly the Eurasian Economic Union's making sense. A lot more trade is being done with Russia, those countries. They're obviously not part of the sanctions regime, so it's mutually beneficial. They're getting more trade and re-export of stuff to Russia, and you see all the figures about, you know, vehicles, you know, that Kyrgyzstan has suddenly imported 6,000% more German cars than it did before the war, and obviously it's not because Kyrgyz are suddenly like Mercedes, it's because we all know where those cars are headed. And the same is true for Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. A lot of trade going on with Russia. So I think Russia is in a bit of a strategic retreat in the South Caucasus, and for sure withdrawing its peacekeepers from Karabakh was a historic first time a Russian peacekeeping mission has ever been wound up in that fashion. But I think Russia is now identified Azerbaijan as its partner. We're seeing a lot of deal making with between the two countries. So just after the peacekeepers went, President Aliyev went to Moscow, had a full day, almost a full day of discussions with President Putin. They were talking about north-south corridors, Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran being the key one. Russia absolutely needs its route connectivity to the Middle East. So I think Azerbaijan is fairly successfully playing both sides. It's talking east-west connectivity and north-south connectivity, and that keeps Russia in the game in the South Caucasus. And something we absolutely have to watch is also this so-called Zangezur corridor, this bit of closed road and rail connections across Armenia, which would connect Azerbaijan with its exclave of Nakhchivan. Both the Russians and Azerbaijanis have been saying that that corridor, when it reopens, should be guarded by Russian border guards, which I think would be a bit of a red flag for the West, because it's suddenly, we're talking about a direct connection between Russia and Iran via Azerbaijan and Armenia down to Iran, with the Russians in control. So I think the Russians are still in the game there. They've done this tactical retreat, but you know, they're not out of it by any means. And
in Central Asia, is the economic muscle enough, along with this show of political respect? For a while we saw.
I mean, I'm not a big Central Asia guy. Clearly, China is in there as well. But again, I think you would read some Western analyses a few years ago about how Russia and China were competing in Central Asia, and that might provide some opportunities. But clearly, I think that was all a bit premature. Clearly, Russia and China, you know, are fairly good at coordinating as well, and for reasons of geography and regime type, you know, the West definitely lags quite a way behind in Central Asia.
But we did see a moment when some of the Central Asian leaders were not quite as deferential to Putin as they had been.
Yeah, I think it's a more equal partnership, for sure. But, you know, I think it's more of a business arrangement maybe before, and less of a colonial arrangement.
So questions?
Galinde Neus from NATO, where I'm in charge of cooperating with pretty much all these partners you talked about, starting with Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and many more. Perhaps just two comments and then one question. When it comes to Central Asia, at least from what I'm seeing, what we are seeing is that in many ways, most of these countries are reinforcing their multi-vector policies, so they try to really be as flexible as they possibly can. And we see a bit of that on the NATO side. I think the EU probably sees a bit of that on their side. And then also part of the increasing trade relations between Central Asia and Russia is probably due to other countries using them to bypass the sanctions as the loopholes. Yeah, so I think a big part of that increase is due to that. But my question actually is, if we are observing all that and we have Putinism as a regime which is rogue and will remain rogue, is imperialistic and will remain imperialistic, with the impact it has on its neighbors, but also beyond that in Africa, in Latin America, you take it. What do we do about all this? What are the initiatives we need to think of in order to regain the initiative? Because we can analyze and observe endlessly and let the initiative and also the escalation initiative with Putin. Yeah. So do we need to, just to kickstart your ideas perhaps, do we need to develop a containment strategy against Russia or with Russia? And if so, how could that look like? Do we need to combine the EU enlargement, which arguably only involves a few of these countries, and you made the right point, it will take a long time before they actually will be members. Do we need to combine this with some incentives in between so they don't lose the motivation, if you wish, because it's a long haul. Yeah? What do we learn from the fact that we have left Ukraine and Georgia in gray zones? Yeah? At least on both on the EU and NATO side. Yeah? What do we learn from that? Is that something eventually a mistake we should not repeat? So I'll leave it at that.
Lots of, I mean, you've great questions, which I think we need about 3 hours probably to discuss. I mean, you know, clearly, you know, I said earlier that I think regime type matters. I think there's a certain amount one can offer to, you know, one-party authoritarian regimes that we you know, uphold their sovereignty, that, you know, we do not countenance Russian aggression against them. But there's a, you know, but there are certain limitations to one's engagement, particularly if you're the EU, to a country which is not a democracy. You know. So I think the real focus has to be on those countries which, you know, are democracies, where there's a societal forces which really want to move towards the EU. And I you know, there are three obvious cases, which are all very different: Armenia, Moldova, and Georgia. Georgia, obviously, with now an increasingly illiberal government, which is really, you know, I think going against its own constitution. But I think there, you know, the engagement absolutely needs to be stepped up. You know, and the EU, I think, has done pretty well. You know, first ever monitoring mission, for example, in Armenia, in a country which is still a CSTO member. That's quite remarkable. But you know, is that enough? Almost certainly not. You know, NATO is a bit more tricky when you're looking at a CSTO member. You know, there's occasional bits of, you know, training, but the cooperation has its limits. So I think that for me is part of it, and the other part is obviously, as you said, enlargement is obviously I would still think the EU's biggest, you know, foreign policy incentive and tool, but it obviously needs that tool needs sharpening, and I think we've many debates in this town about how to do that. One of them is obviously making it more gradual to get some of the benefits of it earlier without full accession, and then the other issue, which is more procedural, which I don't know what my colleagues think, which is very hard to fix, is that, you know, what do you do about the unanimity principle when it takes just one country to block enlargement, as we've seen, you know, Macedonia being blocked by Bulgaria, and you know what if, you know, one EU country suddenly, you know, Hungary might try and block Ukraine. What does one do in those circumstances? So I think these are all hopefully issues for the next commission to deal with. This commission has restarted enlargement, but then you know, how meaningful it is, you know, will obviously be up to the next commission.
And it'll only take a quarter century, as Alissa was pointing out. Alissa, jump in here. I have a couple thoughts, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to make a couple of quick points so we have time for, because it's a very good question and hard question. But just to come back to Ukraine, right? Everybody is watching Ukraine, and I think it does begin, you know, you talk about containment for Russia, but one of the things that Putin has sort of felt emboldened, and sort of we've seen him. You know, there was a ceremony where he was quaffing champagne and kind of saying Ukraine doesn't have an arms industry, so, you know, we're doing so much better than them and producing more. To a certain extent, right? The support for Ukraine has to show that the EU and the US is talking the walk, walking the talk. What do you say? Which hasn't been the case with the frozen US support, with all the difficulties in ramping up arms production in Europe, with, you know, all of the obstacles maybe the magical thinking around the counteroffensive, any number of things. But, you know, so that I think is the first thing, but also because at Crisis Group we look at conflict, and there is the reality of these frozen conflicts, not in Central Asia so much, although there is conflict as well there in the border issues, but in Georgia and Moldova, you know, there is a Russian presence there. I mean, they're building a base in Abkhazia now, so a naval base. So there has to be a realistic engagement, and this has to be part of the discussions now already of what the new security architecture looks like, how you can encourage any kind of thinking around solutions and dealing with those issues as part of the enlargement process, without it being an escalation of tensions that can be really difficult in some of those areas. And then there's just the hard economic realities where I think, for example, in Moldova, the EU has done a really good job in helping it diversify its energy, from its energy dependence on Russia. But, how real is that in some other places, like in Central Asia? Is that even possible at the moment?
So I'll jump in quickly, and I'm still in the business of just fact reporting. The impolite but factual response to your question is that NATO and the West need to understand that all of its Russia policy has failed, that its containment policy has failed, that its approach to this war has barely kept Ukraine alive. More than a year ago, I was at NATO headquarters asking colleagues of yours, what are you going to do when Ukraine runs out of soldiers? Because Ukraine is going to run out of soldiers. President Macron has jumped in to create some strategic ambiguity by saying NATO should not rule out troops on the ground. But those of us who have covered him closely know that his only goal is the ambiguity part. There's not much strategic thought going on there. So unless the West and NATO confront the reality that the policy toward Putinism has failed abjectly up until this moment, if a destroyed Ukraine is the goal, okay, there's still a Ukraine, barely, it's hanging on. But Russia is rearming fast. Its military-industrial complex is now outproducing the West. Europe, in fact, should be terrified at the level of production that's going on and the amount of shells that now Russia is able to either get from its partners in Asia and the Middle East or to produce. So it's a very ugly picture. When folks ask me, when will Russia change? My quick answer usually is unless there is a total defeat of Russia and a national reconciliation and introspection on the scale of what happened in Germany after World War II, there is no indication that anything is going to change. The folks who want to talk about negotiations are overlooking the fact that Putin came for Crimea 8 years ago. Whatever he gets now, he'll be back in 8 years or sooner for another bite down the line. So it's not a optimistic or a friendly or a polite response, but there's some hard introspection that's needed in Brussels and in Washington before there's any path forward. Let me put one question out to. Okay.
I'm Ricardo from Finable. And how does Putin reconcile, or at least explain to his international partners, conservative Christian values at home with closer ties with an Islamic Republic in Iran and a communist regime in China? Because the two things don't seem to match.
You were going to ask about his divorce, the children out of wedlock, the girlfriends, but I'll turn to my colleagues for a more geopolitical response.
Russia's always had an imperial hybrid ideology, pick and mix. Russia is itself about 20% Muslim, for sure, Putin has been appropriating the Orthodox Church and so on. But he's also keeps with other faith leaders in Russia to try and keep them on board. So it's like a lot of imperial visions. It's quite inclusive. Inclusive, not in which in this case shouldn't have a positive meaning, but inclusive of various forms of illiberalism. Let me say.
I mean, the simple way I describe this is that Putin is an advocate for spheres of influence, and at this point, fanatical ideologues and religious fanatics have more in common than they do with a multilateral democratic process. So Putin would be perfectly okay with an Islamic realm led by Erdogan or anybody else that kind of keeps to its place, and he will take care of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And there is a huge Muslim population in Russia, but it is kept down with a boot on its throat. Mosques can't get built in Moscow. It's quite dramatic. And at one point he had opened his borders, which he doesn't do very much, to send as many fighters who wanted to go join the Islamic State to die there as possible, right? And it's a very cynical thing. And if you look for consistency with China, the same. There's a very long border out there with China, and if I were Putin, I would be worried about climate change and what happens when, more than 1 billion Chinese get hot and thirsty. Where are they going? But that doesn't seem to be the concern at the moment. The bigger issue is getting back Ukraine and.
The bottom line, if I may, is I think that he wants to promote and has long wanted to promote the idea of a multipolar world, a non-US hegemonic world, and anybody who, and there are increasingly more and more people, or more and more countries, I should say, and leaders who are enthusiastic about that vision of the world. That's the pragmatic relationship that they have on the international level, I think.
Yeah, I agree. A quick question online. I'm sure this one is directed to Tom. What's the assessment of the demonstrations against Prime Minister Pashinyan? Could they destabilize Armenia?
Probably not. You know, Mr. Pashinyan has clearly lost a lot of popularity in Armenia for a lot of missteps, and in the last 2 years, that the loss of two conflicts with Azerbaijan. Having said that, I think he's still more popular than anyone else, and so I think the Armenian public is, one, tired of conflict, doesn't want more conflict, and two, sort of supports him by default. So he's agreed to give up 4 villages on the border with Azerbaijan to Azerbaijan. These are, no one questions that these were Azerbaijani villages. I guess the criticism is that he gave them up without getting much obvious in return. And you know, people in those regions have come to demonstrate. There's a local bishop suddenly popped up and who no one had particularly heard of, leading this demonstration, and then the bishop stood in the square outside and said, "Pashinyan, you have 1 hour to resign." The trouble with that kind of ultimatum is the hour goes and then Pashinyan doesn't resign, and then why should he? He's a democratically elected leader and you're a bishop with a grudge against me. So clearly I think it's a sign, it's a warning signal to Pashinyan to, you know, to be serious, that, you know, there's a limit to the amount of concessions he can make to Azerbaijan. Having said that, I don't think this is a credible opposition, and you know, we may even this year get some kind of peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You know, how sustainable that is another issue, but you know, I think that would be a result for Pashinyan, who's been, you know, taking negotiations with Azerbaijan pretty seriously.
And a related quick follow-up from online. What do you make of the Pashinyan-Blinken von der Leyen trilateral on
the one here
yeah.
in Brussels on April the 5th? Well, I think that was I think it was a good turnout, a good show of support for Armenia. You know, hundreds of millions of dollars were promised. Let's see how that works out. But you know, clearly, if you're in Armenia, you see that as a positive, but you also want to see long-term assistance, not just a one-off event. And then there's obviously the issue of security assistance. Russia is basically no longer selling weapons to Armenia. The Russian military alliance is no longer fit for purpose. So who else is going to, you know, guarantee your security? A bit from France, a bit from India is coming in, but clearly Azerbaijan remains far better equipped and armed than Armenia does.
And of course, just a reminder, maybe you talked about this, for those who see enlargement as a solution, that Armenia was an Eastern Partnership country, right? And the EU is operating in a deficit in a way of trying to get back to that sort of more vibrant connection. And then I have a question online for you.
I was just going to add something about timing, because I think it's interesting. I mean, the talks, the bilateral peace talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan led to this first sort of deal in December, where Armenia basically got rid of its veto, or lifted its veto in exchange for a prisoner exchange on Azerbaijan hosting the COP this year. So we do see this international engagement on the one hand after Azerbaijan retook Nagorno-Karabakh in September, and before its hosting of the climate talks in November, where there is this kind of sort of timeline of perhaps increased international engagement and you know, sort of attention to the South Caucasus, and also a desire on Azerbaijan's part of maybe being wary of its international image, I think.
So let's take one more online, and then we'll come back to the room. Easy one for you, Alissa, which is, what would a Trump presidency mean for the near abroad? The EU, the West in general?
I'm going to be contrarian on this one. How about we don't all assume that it automatically means, I mean, we've heard everything that Trump has said about NATO, you know, about the transatlantic alliance, about sort of forcing a deal on Ukraine, or he didn't say forcing a deal, but certainly having a peace deal within what did he say? 24 hours, right. But, you know, the Ukraine, the aid package went through. There are other voices in the Republican Party. Let's just be open to the idea that maybe it's not that clearly set.
I'll put it a different way, which is the only thing you can predict about Trump is that it's completely unpredictable. We saw all the things he said about NATO, and then by the end of his term, Stoltenberg was declaring victory, right? Mission accomplished, because Trump had gone out and said NATO was no longer irrelevant. Now he swung back the other way, and you know, Russia should do whatever the hell it wants with the countries that don't pay up. So I'd say smart to not predict too much at all.
One thing, though, even though there's been a deficit, you know, with the attention of the U.S. administration on Gaza, on any number of issues, for all that, Blinken, Biden have been interested in the Balkans, in the South Caucasus, you know, in Ukraine. Whether there will be that same level of engagement and interest on the part of a new U.S. administration is unlikely.
And at the same time, a colleague of mine, Michael Birnbaum, who's based in Brussels for a while, pointed out in a story the other day, he's covering Blinken, who was in Kiev, that Blinken has made 7 trips to the Middle East since October 7th, and 4 to Ukraine since February 22nd, 24th, 2022. So clearly a distraction in Washington, overly focused. Some of us would argue that whatever Hamas does, it's not coming for NATO or the United States, but to be seen. Any more questions in the room, please?
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. Anna Caprile from the European Parliament Research Service, following Russia and other former Soviet countries. And one very concrete question. We often say that the European Union or NATO, we don't have much agency in those countries. This is certainly the case for some of them, but enlargement is clearly a leverage. And with Georgia, we have a very clear case. So very concrete, what is your advice? What the European Union should do? Well, we know that the president of Georgia has vetoed the law. We know that it will be represented in the parliament, and the Georgian Dream has the numbers to put it back. And more worryingly, we also have Republika Srpska doing very similar one. So we are setting a precedent. So the European Parliament, for example, pushed for the enlargement, for the candidate status to be given to Georgia, and now has requested the European Union to act decisively against. So I've seen several opinions for and against, saying that if we stop the enlargement process, this will derail the process and will put Georgian society against the EU. On the other side, being very permissive and knowing that this law will be used for the October elections to reduce civic space, etc., etc. So what should we do? Very concrete. We are going to criticize the EU no matter what does, but I want your opinion beforehand.
Over to the panelists. The folks who say the EU has no agency haven't stood outside on Maidan in Kiev and watched people demonstrating wrapped in the European flag, ready to die with the EU flag around them, or in Tbilisi.
Where you know, there are almost as many.
No, what I say is that in Georgia we have agency.
We have.
In some other countries we don't.
Yeah.
But in one country
No, for sure.
And in Ukraine you did have, but it's a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it back to Tom about the issue of his bishop that he described in Armenia, where be careful what you threaten, right? For a while the EU was threatening over the foreign agent law, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, because you're going to lose your candidate status, and then they do it, and it's like, all of a sudden they have to be silent because they can't follow through on the threat. Why? Because of course that would be giving Putin exactly what he wants and Georgian Dream exactly what they want. So it is quite a predicament.
Yeah, I mean, it is a predicament. I mean, clearly the EU, does have agency, does have leverage in Georgia, both positive and negative. I mean, when it comes to sanctions, obviously, which people are talking about, the US obviously has much more power because it doesn't have the unanimity principle. One can suspect that Hungary would veto a sanctions package on some of these Georgian Dream figures, whereas the US will have no such qualms on doing that. But individual member states can still do that, and there can still be message that that we are slowing down the accession process. We're not cancelling it, but we're slowing it down. I think, but for sure, I think the messages coming out of the EU to Georgia in public have been, a bit soft, and I hope that there's more being said in private. I mean, for me, the key issue here is actually that Georgian democracy is on the line. That what we're seeing is a series of steps which look like state capture, which look like a power grab by the ruling party. It's not just the foreign agents law, it's also less remarked on, and you can see the piece I just published today because I go through this. Several laws on the economic side, one which the National Bank watering down who can be sanctioned. There's one where they seem to be taking over the Georgian pension fund, the government, and the most worrying one is one which exempts assets from offshore assets, which coming back to Georgia are exempted from tax. This seems to be a green light to not only to Mr. Ivanishvili's assets, but also to Russians to try and use Georgia as a tax haven. So there's some clear sanctions proofing going on by this business elite. So I think they need to get a very tough message that we are noticing that the EU is noticing that. But I think the other issue on democracy is is to try and get to the elections without a major confrontation, without violence, and to have and try and get this off the streets into elections which are as free and fair as possible, and put those elections under big scrutiny. Because I think Georgian Dream has miscalculated. I don't think they have the massive backing of the public. I think a lot of people who are swing voters have been very turned off by their repressive actions and the police violence and so on. So I think there is a chance of a competitive election in Georgia, and I think that's what should be focused on. Maybe it could even be brought forward from October. Maybe that should be one of the talking points. But it is really worrying, and I think if I would use one word about this, what the state of mind of this Georgian Dream leadership, it is paranoia. They do believe that people are out to get to them, and I think that needs to be factored in. So I think talking about elections and saying we're not interested in regime change, we're only interested in elections, is also part of the messaging.
There does need to be a competitive opposition for competitive elections, yes, right? And
which there isn't at the moment. But there is a 5% threshold in the parliament. So if some of these small parties, a bunch of small parties can get 5%, then suddenly you might end up with a coalition of opposition parties which are do much better in the Georgian parliament.
One thing that we saw in Georgia and in Brussels vis-a-vis Georgia was the EU's own internal fighting playing out there. Charles Michel freelancing, Borrell saying one thing, von der Leyen saying something else. This is before the recent flare-up and protest about the foreign agents law. But if you want the Georgian opposition to coalesce in favor of freedom and democracy and rule of law. It might help if Brussels was also coordinated in pursuit of that goal. Alissa, sorry. Cutting off there.
Yeah, perhaps just 2 quick points. I mean, you bring up the Balkans, right? I think that's the what not to do story of that's the what not to do story of EU enlargement, right? We've seen democratic backsliding. We've seen, targets moving. We've seen sort of engagement wax and wane over the years in the Balkans, and a society that doesn't necessarily believe in enlargement anymore. So let's not repeat that after this momentum at the moment, and certainly again from the crisis group perspective, let's not forget that these conflicts linger and they come back, and the Balkans, people are still dealing with the conflicts of the 90s and the unresolved issues there, and there could have been more done with the enlargement process and certainly engagement in the region over the years, even though there has been obviously negotiation and facilitation efforts. And just one small point, because we were in Russia when the foreign agent law came in, when these new measures on LGBTQ rights came in, civil society needs support. It is anything and everything, even this is going to be an incredibly difficult time if this law, this law is here to stay. We can expect to see civil society already, I was having a talk, I was part of a talk with the UN where there were people from the region who it's scary and it's isolating, and anything you can do to have that outreach, to have that sharing of experience, to have support for civil society actors at this time is valuable, however little.
Extrapolating from Alissa's good point, one secret to success in politics is to under-promise and over-deliver. The EU has a habit of over-promising, and certainly in the Balkans, and under-delivering. So flipping that equation anywhere in the near abroad might help quite a lot. Any other questions in the room? Yeah, go ahead. We have a mic coming to you. One sec.
Last one, yeah.
Okay. Last one.
I'll be very quick. Hello, my name is Christina. I represent civil society, the Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum based here in Brussels. We're a network of civil society organizations in the region. I have a question about the Russian society, and to me there are two societies now, Russians in Russia and Russians abroad, right? So it's this notion of good Russians, so-called good Russians, right, that we hear in the discussions. What is their role in navigating any potential change in the future? So where are these people? Because a couple of weeks ago here in Brussels, I attended a very interesting, on the Press Freedom Day, a discussion where one Russian opposition journalist who I listened to, etc., he mentioned that we should talk to Russians in Russia. We should talk with them about the war by not speaking with them about the war. What do you think about this? Is this a good strategy? And so this part is about Russians in Russia, and then about Russians abroad. What is their role? Because I'm from Georgia, I'm really not biased or emotional. It's just these people don't have support, right? Why is that? Are they not vocal enough? Are they not clear enough? How can they be supported better, if that's clear? Thanks.
Support from whom? Sorry, just
from us, from all of us, like international audience. I don't know, their friends who we want normal Russia to exist at last.
Great question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tragic situation, isn't it? I mean, we're back suddenly to, I grew up in the, I saw the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and I from it went to a position where there was no Russian society one could talk to. Suddenly there was a Russian society, and we're back. We've gone backwards. And how does one support the people living in a one-party oppressive state. We know we know that there's a diversity of opinion in Russia. We see these people occasionally. You know, we suddenly saw them for a day at Navalny's funeral, turning up, and now they've disappeared again. And I don't know that we have any answers in particular about don't do stupid stuff, don't close down all connections to Russia. You know, keep minimal engagement. But you know, I don't think there are any answers in the short term. It's all about trying to keep those people alive until something changes.
Turning out for Navalny's funeral and turning out at noon on the election day, right? Showing, you know, that there were dissenting voices, many of them around the world. But I think we have to keep in mind how, keep it in perspective. Does anybody expect an exiled Chinese opposition to have any success in changing China? At this point, again, sorry for the cynical and unfriendly facts, but the Russian opposition are either imprisoned, dead like Navalny, or exiled. And it's extremely difficult.
No, I mean, I think that's right, but I mean, just concretely, there have been some, you know, people who fled either because they didn't want to fight or because they were labeled foreign agents in Russia or because they were journalists who couldn't do their job anymore, who are now in Georgia, right? There's been different kinds of people who left Russia for different reasons, but certainly, well, not everybody was super welcoming in Georgia even at some point, but you know, the kind of calls to ban visas for all Russians, to not support or outreach to people who had no choice but to leave the country or face jail. Personally, I think that is not, you know, there was some rhetoric about all Russians should go back and stage a revolution against Putin. That's not really realistic, you know. So let's be human about our policies in some sense. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult. I mean, I think channels should remain open. I think there should be outreach. I think there should be Russian language media, both within and without the region, and help with VPNs and all of that stuff. But not everybody agrees.
Well, thank you. Quick last thoughts, Tom.
No,
summing
thank
up.
you all for coming. There will be, for those of you with us in person, I think we're going to have a little reception, so stick around and chat to us. Thank you all, those of you online, for joining us.